I've given this talk a title. I've called it Patriotism as a Human Right. And I want to talk today about pride, having pride in your nation and your people. In particular, I want to talk about the morality of such pride. I want to explain why it's not only normal and moral, but essential for a fully functioning and sustainable society. They say that pride goes before the fall, but while excessive pride can be destructive, a lack of pride can be equally disastrous. It's becoming increasingly obvious that the constant attacks on British-descended and European people, their history, their culture and identity, are undermining the fabric of our entire nation. There are many compelling reasons to support the British monarchy. Many of you will recognise this as a fantastic form of government. Others will love the pomp and ceremony or the royals themselves. But I want to hazard a guess, and forgive me if I'm wrong here, but at least some of you probably enjoy supporting the monarchy in part because it's one of the few ways left to legitimately express pride in your history, your culture, your people and your identity. This should strike you all as strange. It isn't normal to feel, or natural to feel ashamed of your people. Dubai was a slave trading port for centuries, yet the Emiratis don't feel shame for that. The Chinese wiped out over 40 million of their own people, yet their government still insists they were 70% right, and their people don't feel shame for what happened. And there's a good reason why this is so. Humans are the ultimate apex predators. This isn't because of our strength or even our intelligence. If you were surrounded by a pack of hyenas, you wouldn't be able to outsmart them. Our power lies in our extraordinary communication skills. We're able to communicate and develop complex group strategies to overcome almost any obstacle. These communication skills, however, are only of a benefit when we work together in a group. When we form a group, whether a family group, a tribe or a nation, we accrue immense power. Then our greatest threats tend to come from other groups of humans. Because of this, our well-being, both in a personal sense and in an evolutionary sense, depends to a great extent on the well-being of our own group. Not surprisingly then, we're evolved to support our group and to feel great solidarity with it. Whether family, tribe or nation, in the right circumstances, it's not unusual for people to risk their lives for their group. Just like other creatures, groups of humans need their own territory in order to flourish, whether it's the family home or their nation. When we control territory and secure our borders, we can feel safe and go about our business unmolested by members of other groups. Securing the borders is one of the most important functions of the state. The other thing we need to flourish is leadership that's both competent and loyal. Having the wrong leadership can be catastrophic. Naturally, people want their group to be led by people who belong to and have loyalty to their group. They have greater trust in people who have the same language, culture, and sense of shared heritage. This is why empires collapse. The further out the empire grows, the greater the resistance people have to being controlled by people who don't look like them or talk like them. Both Nelson Mandela and Mahatma Gandhi fought for the right of their people to be ruled over by others who looked like them. No one blamed them for that. But what if a group of people were made to feel ashamed of themselves? What if they were constantly told that their group is responsible for all the bad in the world? Supposing they were told from school onwards that their ancestors were monsters who ruined the world for everyone else, what would happen to them? Well, if most people were to internalise this shame and guilt, then obviously the group will soon cease to function as a group. The members of the group will no longer wish to belong to the group or to defend other members. Should this happen, Individuals from that group will be at the mercy of the groups around them, because as a collection of individuals, they will have little capability to fight back against groups who attack them, even if those groups are much smaller. If you want an example of what this looks like, look no further than an English town called Rotherham, and numerous English towns like it. From at least the early 1990s, gangs of Pakistani men began raping and enslaving very young British girls en masse. These girls were mostly aged from 11 to 16 years old. The really odd thing about this incident was that the police and the social services ignored everyone who reported these crimes. They even bullied and threatened people in order to avoid reporting or dealing with these crimes. So here's a question for you. Why on earth would they do that? It appears that the British police came to believe that looking after members of their own group, even the most vulnerable, was evil. This evil had a name. It was called racism. Unbelievably, the desire to not even appear racist trumped the desire to protect young English girls from the most horrific abuse imaginable. Oddly, however, this racism was only deemed wrong when performed by white British people. The Pakistani community was so loyal to their own people that they mostly covered up for these child rapists. Yet no one called them out as racists or made them feel ashamed because of this. Since Pakistan came into being in 1947, it's had numerous wars with its neighbours, and minorities there live in constant fear. In 1970, in its war against its eastern province, which is now called Bangladesh, and I'm quoting here, members of the Pakistani military and supporting militias engaged in mass murder, deportation and genocidal rape, pursuing a systematic campaign of annihilation against nationalist Bengali citizens, students, intelligentsia, religious minorities and armed personnel. End quote. There's much more, but you get the idea. Yet Pakistanis in Britain are allowed to feel pride in their people, whilst the British are expected to feel only shame. Making racial slurs against people of Pakistani heritage in England would be likely to have you arrested. Making racial slurs against indigenous British people carries no such penalties. Why the different treatment? Compare this to World War II. In 1941, during the Blitz, my own mother was 11 years old, the same age as many of the victims in Rotherham. Night after night, she cowered, terrified under the kitchen table as bombs rained down around her. Fortunately for her, however, up in the night sky, young Englishmen were flying Spitfires, risking their lives and battling to protect her. Those young men didn't know my mother. They would never meet her. They risked their lives night after night to protect the people below who were part of their group. Was that immoral? Of course not. The British have done some bad things in history, like every other nation. Yet it was still entirely moral for these young men to risk their lives protecting their group, their nation, and their people. Everyone has a natural right to care for and protect their own people, just as we have a right to care for and protect our families. We don't need to prove that our children are perfect angels to be allowed to protect them. So this feeling of pride, of solidarity with and love for our people and heritage should not be dependent on proving that our people are entirely without blame throughout history. The pride that many of us feel in the monarchy should not depend on proving that monarchs have always been perfect. Our pride is not an immoral thing, and it's not a trivial thing. Were the police who abandoned the little girls in Rotherham to unspeakable crimes by the Pakistani rape gangs moral? Were they doing the right thing? Were they more moral than the Spitfire pilots who protected their people? Or were they the bad guys? And what about the people who stood by silently whilst our people were being maligned and denigrated? and the people who screamed and threatened anyone who wouldn't accept their black armband pseudo-history and sense of shame? Were they the good guys or the bad guys? If you want to know the answer to that question, perhaps you could ask some of the victims from Rotherham or the many other English towns where this happened. Because make no mistake, if we carry on as we're going, this will be the final destination of this ride of shame that we find ourselves on. In 1970, Australia was mostly British, with some new European migrants and a small number of indigenous and other nationalities who were assimilating successfully. Today, after decades of undemocratic, non-discriminatory immigration, white Australians are on track to becoming an overall minority within a short time. In many areas, we already are. The government obfuscates the figures, but it's likely that our children are already close to this point. Rather than slowing down, the immigration intake is accelerating while our birth rates are dropping alarmingly. Once we become a minority, we will lose our ability to exercise power democratically. Will we then be treated in the same way that we have treated other minorities? Will the Human Rights Commission start protecting us? Will we be a protected minority? Have a look around the world at the terrible treatment of minorities in other countries, including the countries where many of our migrants come from. Have a think about what others say about us now, while we're still the majority. Will they change their mind when they assume power? That seems doubtful. Perhaps an even more pressing question is, what can we do about it right now? That is the question that the British Australian community has dedicated itself to answering. If we want to turn things around, then we believe it's imperative to restore the right of the European Australians to feel proud of their people. We know we can do this without hostility towards non-white Australians. Our belief is that the first thing that we need to do is to analyse the arguments of our opponents and to see whether they hold up. This should have been done long ago by our universities. Unfortunately, our universities have been captured by people who despise us. That's why school curriculum and university curriculum are so Anglophobic. The intellectual basis of our enemies' attacks on us are like castles built on sand. The problem is, you can't get near those castles without being attacked. This is asymmetric warfare, and we're not the strong ones. The basis of our opponents' success has been to convince us that we must not look out for the interests of our group. They achieved this by instilling a feeling of shame, by constantly pointing out every fault that every white person ever did. Once they captured the universities and the media, they didn't even need to be truthful about things. They can and do fabricate historical narratives which are false, that are difficult for ordinary people to debunk. Meanwhile, we're constantly told that we must celebrate, protect and advocate for the interests of all other groups. Once our narcissistic elites achieved this paradigm, the rest was like taking candy from a baby. They've guilt-tripped us into giving away our country, one diverse migrant at a time. The justification being that these migrants will enrich our obviously defective culture and dilute our inherently evil influence. Our job then is to convince people otherwise, to make them understand that feelings of patriotism, of loving your country and your people, are not immoral. If we could do this, it would all be over by next weekend. Unfortunately, it isn't that simple. Our antagonists are no fools. Anyone advocating for white Europeans to feel pride in their people can expect to come under intense pressure. If you happen to be in schools, universities, large companies, media or the government, the pressure will be intolerable. The British Australian community is not dependent on any of those large institutions and can therefore avoid the worst of this pressure. We've also positioned ourselves as part of the multicultural community. This positioning, along with our history and careful analysis, give us the potential to be a formidable force in this space. We can advocate, lobby, analyse and fight for our people in a way that no one else is doing. Navigating through this minefield is tricky. So far, the BAC has shown an admirable ability to do this. As part of this advocacy, we also write books, such as Anglophobia, the Unrecognised Hatred, an early version of which was published in Quadrant magazine. We also produce high-quality videos, which you've just seen one of, and are beginning to organise events and functions for our people to meet up. Our strategy so far has been to prioritise attracting quality people who understand our message and can work with us to grow the organisation sustainably. We've put this ahead of rapid growth. So far, this has been successful. After a long period of rebuilding the organisation and putting the right structures in place, we're now engaging in our core role as a defensive ethnic agency. We care about our people's well-being. That does not mean that we feel animosity towards others, any more than prioritising our own children is driven by hatred of other people's children. We want the best for all people. But our job is to defend the interests of Anglo-Celtic and European Australians. We do this because our people are a vital cultural and demographic interest, and because doing so is moral, and because no one else is doing it. We know that our ancestors were not perfect. We know that some of them engaged in slavery and colonialism. We acknowledge that they made mistakes. They were human after all, but we also acknowledge the greatness of our people who invented modernity itself. So just as we can demand the right to feel proud of an imperfect monarchy, we also demand the right to take great pride in our imperfect people, our imperfect ancestors, and our imperfect culture, simply because they are ours. We support the right of other ethnic or religious groups to defend the interests of their people, but we insist that we be allowed to do the same for our people without being denigrated for it. Thank you.